The Comtesse of Crime, The Hotel Thief of the Belle Époque. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Ivy. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. In the Belle Époque, the Riviera did not merely host the wealthy. It trained them. It taught men and women to expect velvet carpets, discreet service, and doors that closed softly behind them. It taught them that danger belonged elsewhere, in the crowded districts far from the sea, in the alleys where respectable people did not go. The hotels were different. The hotels were civilized. That belief, that luxury is protection, is the first weakness in this case. This book concerns a woman who moved through those hotels under a title that opened every door it touched. She was known publicly as the Comtesse de Montiel, and she was later identified in contemporary reporting as Amelie Condemine. Police reporting, as relayed by the press, concluded that she was not aristocratic at all. She came from modest circumstances, and her aged mother lived simply near Macon in Burgundy. Yet she lived in great luxury, despite having no known fortune. A mismatch that followed her like a shadow through hotel lobbies and seaside promenades. The crime here is theft, but it is also something more precise. Passing. The Countess did not simply steal jewels. She stole the assumption that titles were true. She stole the comfort that manners and clothing were proof of character. She stole, above all, the sense that high society could recognize its own. Reports described her as moving among genuine nobility in resort towns such as Biarritz and Arcachon. Trusted, welcomed, rarely questioned. She formed friendships of both sexes, and in some cases became close to the families she later robbed, close enough, it was said, to offer assistance in tracking the thief after the theft had occurred. The theft itself was frequently quiet, and its announcement was delayed until morning. A missing jewel case, a disturbed handbag, an absence that could not be explained without admitting a more unsettling possibility, that the corridor outside one's hotel room was not safe after all. This manuscript is written under a strict standard. No invention. Everything asserted as fact in these pages is drawn from verifiable sources, primarily contemporary newspaper reporting and contemporary descriptions attributed to police investigation, supported by secondary works only when they reproduce or cite those contemporaneous accounts. Where the record is incomplete, it remains incomplete on the page. Where sources disagree, the disagreement is recorded. When names are withheld or anonymized in surviving reporting, they remain withheld. This is not simply a stylistic choice. It is the only honest way to write about an era that loved to mythologize its criminals, especially its female criminals. The Countess was repeatedly framed as a creature of glamour and danger, a figure for the public to both fear and admire. She was called in different contexts a hotel mouse and a queen of thieves, language that turns a criminal career into a legend. This book does not attempt to escape the spell of that language. It attempts to account for it. The press mattered. It shaped what the public believed and what the police were required to answer for. But it is also a source that must be handled carefully, with an awareness of exaggeration, moral panic, and theatrical framing. For this reason, the book makes a clear distinction between verified events, reported claims, and context. Verified events are anchored to a date, a place, and a documentable report. Reported claims are details preserved in newspapers that cannot be independently confirmed with the records currently available. Context is the historical background that makes the world legible, used to illuminate how a crime could occur without asserting private facts that are not in evidence. You will not find invented dialogue in these pages. You will not be asked to accept imagined childhood trauma as explanation. If the record does not tell us her schooling, friendships, or the private interior of her life, those silences are not filled. The story of Amelie Condemine survives not as a single continuous narrative but as scattered fragments. Place names, dates, police traces, arrest descriptions, lists of what was found, and the aftertaste of sensational headlines. To treat those fragments honestly, this book uses a dossier structure. The dossier approach allows the reader to see the case the way authorities and journalists encountered it, piece by piece, across borders, in a sequence of hotels whose corridors look identical until you learn what they conceal. Throughout the manuscript you will encounter brief inserts labeled Case Note. These notes are not decoration. They are the evidentiary spine of the narrative. Each case note records, as precisely as the sources allow, the location and date of an event, the names involved when published, the type of theft, the items stolen or seized when specified, and the source basis for the information. In the back matter, an appendix provides two verification tools: a verified timeline and a victim index. Reporting states that police traced her activity to Brussels, 1898, London, 1899, Nice, 1900, America, 1901, and Arcachon, Menton, and Cannes, 1902 to 1903, among other places. The appendix exists because this case, like many cases wrapped in glamour, invites embellishment. It is an antidote to that temptation. The dossier form does not mean the writing must be sterile. The Belle Époque was a world of surfaces, and those surfaces were tools. The corridor mattered. The clothing mattered. The veil mattered. In the reporting of the Nice arrest, the subject is described leaving her room dressed in black knit outfit, tight black skirt, felt sandals, black veil, carrying an instrument referred to as an ouistiti, and attempting entry into the room of M and Madame X, rich foreigners, when police intervened. These details are not literary ornament. They are operational facts. This is not a book that claims more than it can prove. It is not an excuse to moralize. It is not a fantasy of criminal genius. It is a record of what can be known, of how a false countess moved through a world that rewarded appearances, of how police began to recognize a modern pattern of mobile crime, and of how the public watched, fascinated, as the Riviera's most beautiful rooms proved as vulnerable as any alley. In the end, the case turns on a simple fact. The Riviera glittered and the corridors were quiet, but there was always someone walking there who did not belong. And that is where this file begins. Chapter 1. The Riviera didn't invent her. It only gave her a stage bright enough for everyone to see. Before there was a countess, before there were hotel corridors and missing jewels, there was Amelie Condemine, the name the newspapers would later print behind the title Comtesse de Monteil. Her beginnings, as far as the record allows us to follow them, were not gilded. They were provincial. They were ordinary. The authorities who pursued her were emphatic on that point. Whatever she later claimed to be, she was not born into aristocracy. She came from moderate circumstances, and her mother, elderly by the time of Amelie's arrest, was said to be living quietly near Macon in Burgundy. It is not the kind of origin that seems to lead naturally to roulette tables and winter seasons on the Mediterranean, but that is part of what makes her story unsettling. A great deal of crime asks you to believe in desperation or impulse. This one asks you to believe in something colder: ambition, patience, and a talent for becoming someone else. The record of her childhood is thin in the way the record often is for women of her background. There are no school reports, no preserved letters, no neatly documented early scandal. The documents that survive are the ones produced when a woman becomes a public problem. When police start compiling fragments, when journalists start repeating a name, when a private life becomes a file. What the record gives us is not the warmth of a domestic story, but the chill of a profile. Even so, there are clues. One later researched account describes her father as a butcher in Macon. It is a detail that sits squarely inside the police conclusion that she was not wealthy, not titled, not born into the life she later performed. If it is correct, and it aligns with what the police believed, it places her early world firmly in the realm of work, trade, and the routines of a small city that would never, on its own, grant her entry into Europe's grand hotels. The father's name does not appear in the sources currently available, and no publicly accessible birth record has been located to confirm it. But the detail matters as a direction. It points toward a household where money was counted, not inherited, and where the idea of a countess was a costume, not a destiny. From that ordinary beginning, she produced an extraordinary identity. The countess persona did not operate in the shadows. It operated in plain sight, on verandas and in dining rooms, in foyers where strangers assessed one another with a glance. The sources agree on the simplest and most damning fact: she was received as genuine. In places such as Biarritz and Arcachon, she was well considered by the very people her title was meant to impress. The circles described as genuine nobility. No one demanded proof. No one wanted to embarrass themselves by appearing suspicious. A title, spoken confidently and carried with the right clothes, was enough. That is the first key to understanding how she could steal in the world she chose. In an expensive hotel, most doors are already unlocked. People hand over their privacy the moment a porter takes their luggage. They assume the staff are invisible, that the walls are solid, and that the corridor is safe. Those assumptions are part of the service. Amelie Condemine exploited them. The Countess was not merely a disguise. She was a tool that created access to routines, to rooms, to trust. And then, with trust established, the thefts began to follow her. The most telling line in the reporting is almost casual. In the hotels where she stayed, other guests generally complained of being robbed. That phrasing matters. It suggests repetition. It suggests a pattern that was slow to become obvious, not because the crimes were invisible, but because they were committed in places where people were reluctant to admit they had been fooled. To confess you'd been robbed in a grand hotel was to confess that the world you paid for, the world of velvet and chandeliers, did not protect you. Police, working from those complaints and from the strange mismatch between her lifestyle and her means, built a picture of a woman who lived well beyond her visible income. She had no known fortune, yet she lived in great luxury. She moved as if money was a given. He stayed where the wealthy stayed. He dressed like one of them. He traveled like one of them. But the police believed she was not one of them. In this story, glamour is not the opposite of crime. Glamour is part of the crime. She did not isolate herself. She collected people. She made friends of both sexes. In some instances, she became close to the very families later robbed. Close enough, the reporting says, to offer her help after the theft, even to join the search for the thief. It is hard to overstate the nerve of this. It is also hard to deny its effectiveness. In a panic, people cling to the calmest voice in the room. The Countess could offer that voice while carrying the knowledge that she had already been inside the room in the dark. There was another advantage that helped her survive suspicion. She looked younger than she was. Accounts written around her eventual arrest describe her as well over 40, yet said to appear much younger. In a world that treated women's age as a kind of moral category, youth made her more plausible as a glittering figure on the Riviera. A countess who belonged among the rich and restless, rather than a woman who might be asked hard questions. By the time she appears clearly in the official traces, she is already in motion. Police reported tracing the traces of her exploits through a sequence that reads like a travel itinerary for the well-off. Brussels in 1898, London in 1899, Nice in 1900, America in 1901, then back along the coast, Arcachon, Menton, Cannes in 1902 and 1903, with many other places implied beyond the list. These are not the movements of a thief bound to one city or one alleyway. They are the movements of someone who understands that wealth migrates seasonally, and that hotels are both homes and hunting grounds. Whatever she learned in Macon, whatever she carried from that ordinary beginning, the record shows this much. She learned to travel, she learned to pass, she learned to use a title as a weapon. This book cannot yet tell you the names of her parents, the details of her education, the private scars that might have shaped her. Those details may exist in civil records, in archives, in documents not freely available. This book will not invent them. But it can show you the shape of her transformation as the police saw it. A woman of modest origin, living lavishly without a known fortune, moving from city to city, welcomed by the titled and followed, always followed, by the quiet discovery of loss. Chapter 2. By the time she reached the coast, she understood the first rule of the Riviera. Nobody wanted to ask the wrong question. The hotels were full of people who had come to be seen, to disappear, or to pretend. They arrived with trunks, with jewelry packed into velvet boxes, with the soft confidence that the expensive world was a safer world. A grand hotel did more than provide a bed. Provided a story. You were the sort of person who belonged there. You were protected by the very fact of your belonging. Amelie Condemine's genius, if that is the word, was that she treated this as a system, not a mood. She didn't only steal valuables. She stole access. She stole credibility. She stole the reluctance of polite people to admit they'd been fooled. When she presented herself as the Comtesse de Monteil, the title was not merely decoration. In the places that mattered, resort towns like Biarritz and Arcachon, she was reportedly welcomed and well regarded, accepted among the circles that would have been best placed to spot an impostor. Yet they did not press her for proof. A countess, after all, was meant to be believed. The title bought her the most valuable commodity in any hotel, the right to drift without scrutiny. And then quietly the complaints followed. It was said that in the hotels where she stayed, Other guests generally complained of being robbed. That line reads like gossip until you understand what it implies. A single theft can be dismissed as misfortune or blamed on staff or chalked up to carelessness. But repeated thefts in hotels where the same elegant woman appears, that is not coincidence. That is a map forming in the minds of investigators. A pattern that stretches beyond one building, beyond one city. By the time she is clearly visible in the trace of reported police attention, she has already become a traveler of the wealthy circuit. The places attached to her name read like a route: Brussels in 1898, London in 1899, Nice in 1900, America in 1901, then back along the French coast, Arcachon, Menton, Cannes in 1902 and 1903, with more locations implied beyond the list. It suggests a professional rhythm. Follow the season, follow the money, stay lightly, move often. Amelie Condemine knew how to work with that delay. She made herself part of the hotel's social fabric. She made friends. She cultivated closeness. In some instances she became intimate within families she would later rob, close enough, it was reported, to offer her help when the theft was discovered, even to join the search for the thief. It is a tactic that sounds almost absurd until you remember how people behave in crisis. They cling to the calmest voice in the room. They accept comfort from the person who seems most sympathetic. The Countess offered sympathy as a kind of cover. Not loud, not theatrical, just reliable. There was reportedly an additional advantage: age. Accounts written around her eventual arrest described her as well over 40, yet looking much younger. A woman who appears young and elegant in a resort town is treated differently than a woman who appears older, harder, less decorative. In a society addicted to surfaces, the appearance of youth is not merely flattering, it is protective. The best version of that mechanism is preserved in the account of her capture. In early March 1908 in Nice, she was taken in a manner that reads like a scene staged for a theater. Quiet corridor, pre-dawn hours, a woman dressed in black. The hotel was the Hotel Imperial, near the Promenade d'Anglais. For the first time in her long career, the police were waiting. 2 inspectors of the Sûreté Générale, Benoit and Henique, had followed her. They were attached to a mobile service tasked with pursuing offenders who moved from place to place. The idea that police might have to travel to catch a criminal now seems obvious. At the time it was still a developing logic of law enforcement. Condemine's entire career depended on being harder to pin down than the local officer with a notebook and a key ring. He was a traveler. She required a traveling police force. The details of her arrest matter because they show method rather than myth. She left her room dressed in black. A black knit outfit, a tight black skirt, felt sandals and a black veil. She carried a tool described as one used by hotel thieves, an ouistiti. She moved down the corridor and began to work at a door belonging to a couple described only as M and Madame X, rich foreigners. Their names are not preserved in the account. They were, in the surviving record, reduced to what mattered to her. They were rich and they were asleep behind a door she believed she could open. She did not open it. The police intervened at that moment. The moment the facade turns into evidence. Not a suspicion. Not a rumor. An act. In her room, investigators found what they needed to argue that she was not merely an opportunist but a planner. 4,000 francs in cash, numerous jewels, equipment associated with hotel theft, and most striking of all, a list of hotels accompanied by room plans. The room plans are crucial. A thief who carries maps is a thief who thinks ahead, who studies, who rehearses. It suggests that her crimes were not fueled by impulse but by preparation, and that she treated hotels, these palaces of transience, as predictable structures that could be learned and exploited. Other reporting valued the jewelry found with her at around 20,000 francs, and described her as having lived in a manner consistent with someone spending and storing stolen wealth, not hiding in cheap lodging, but maintaining the outward life of a woman of means, and even, in at least one account, keeping a well-furnished flat in Paris. Whether every detail of those claims can be fully confirmed in court records remains a matter for deeper archival work, but the shape of the picture is consistent across the reporting. She was caught as an elegant intruder, and the items found with her were the material proof of an extended career. Her capture caused a brief tremor in the social world she'd been feeding on. The press could not decide whether to condemn her or admire her. She was described as a hotel mouse, queen of thieves, and in some accounts a spider. The language of crime became the language of fable, because people love a criminal who reflects their own fantasies back at them. She did not steal from the poor. She stole from the people who believed themselves untouchable. That alone was enough to turn her into a kind of folk character. But behind the headlines, a case file was being assembled. The authorities had her in custody. They had tools. They had cash. They had jewels. They had plans. And now, for the first time, they had the one thing she'd spent years avoiding: a fixed point. They had her in a corridor in a hotel at a precise hour. From here, the story becomes less about what she could get away with and more about what could be proven. What thefts could be linked to her movements, what victims would come forward, what property could be identified, what the court would make of a woman who had walked through Europe under a title no one had thought to question. The season was over. The dossier was beginning. Chapter 3. If Macon was where she began, Paris was where she learned the only lesson that mattered. If you look like you belong somewhere, people will do half the work of believing you. The record, even in its gaps, suggests a woman who understood reinvention early. Later reporting and modern reconstructions agree on several points that, while not always supported by a single surviving civil document in the open public record, recur consistently enough to form the accepted outline of her early adult life. She was born around Macon. Her family circumstances were modest. Her father has been described in researched accounts as a butcher, and she made her way into a larger world through marriage and movement. In one widely circulated account, she married at 18 to a wine merchant significantly older than her, and the couple moved to Paris. That marriage is not presented as a romance in the surviving material. It is presented as a hinge, the first clear step out of provincial life and into the city where performance could be taught, copied, and perfected. Paris in the final decades of the 19th century was a place where identity could be bought in pieces. A better dress, a better address, a better name. For a woman without inherited status, the city offered two kinds of power. One was money earned or taken. The other was knowledge. Knowledge of manners, speech, appearance, and the private rituals of the class she intended to imitate. A title in this world was less about blood than it was about fluency. The aristocracy still existed, but the city was full of those orbiting it. The wealthy bourgeois, foreigners with money and poor French, and social climbers who learned quickly that confidence could pass for legitimacy. What the police later insisted upon, that she was not, in fact, a countess, matters here because it suggests she wasn't merely lying about a detail. She was attempting to change the category of person she was. That sort of fraud is never only verbal. It has to be lived. In hotels, in restaurants, in the way a woman speaks to staff and accepts service without embarrassment. By the time she was known as the Comtesse de Monteil, she had learned the important trick. People are reluctant to challenge someone who looks expensive. The more polished the performance, the more humiliating it becomes for an observer to admit doubt. To accuse a woman of being an imposter is to suggest you too cannot read the room. It is far easier to accept her. And she didn't simply appear in public as a countess. She moved like one. She spent winters in the same constellation of towns, Nice, Cannes, and other fashionable stops. And the reporting describes her being welcomed among genuine nobility in places like Biarritz and Arcachon. She mixed in circles where a false title should have been detected. Yet it wasn't, or it wasn't questioned. This detail is crucial because it explains why she could steal the way she did. She wasn't sneaking in. She was being invited. At some point, the thefts began to attach themselves to her presence like a scent. It was said that in the hotels where she stayed, other guests generally complained of being robbed. That sentence is one of the few blunt, recurring claims in the record, and it does a particular kind of work. It suggests a long career built not around a single major crime, but around repeated acts small enough to be missed at first, then undeniable through accumulation. The places traced to her read like a map of wealthy travel. Police reporting later listed a set of locations and years where traces of her exploits were found. Brussels in 1898, London in 1899, Nice in 1900, America in 1901, and then Arcachon, Menton, and Cannes across 1902 and 1903, with many other stops implied. It is a movement pattern that tells you as much about her as any childhood detail could. This is the pattern of a professional who follows the money and avoids staying long enough for a local officer to build a file. Mobility is not just movement. It is strategy. It is the weapon of a criminal who understands the limits of a local police force. If she stole and vanished quickly, she could leave behind a trail of isolated complaints rather than a cohesive case. But she did more than move. She embedded. Accounts describe her making friends of both sexes and, in some instances, becoming close to families she later robbed, close enough to offer assistance after the theft, even to join the search for the thief. This detail is among the most unsettling in the case because it speaks to the kind of confidence game that becomes more dangerous than burglary. A burglar breaks in from outside. A confidence thief is already inside, and if she is sufficiently trusted, she can reframe herself as a protector rather than a suspect. This is how the Comtesse de Montiel survived suspicion for as long as she did. She wasn't only stealing property. She was managing narrative. She positioned herself on the side of the victim, distressed, sympathetic, helpful, while holding the knowledge of what she had taken. It is not hard to imagine how effective this would have been in an expensive hotel, where people wanted to believe the theft was an anomaly and where blaming an elegant guest would feel socially catastrophic. Her appearance, too, was part of the mechanism. At the time of her eventual capture, she was described as well over 40 yet looking much younger, not more than 28 in one account. In a world that treated women's age as a kind of moral measure, looking young helped sustain the fantasy of the Countess, the glamorous woman of leisure, passing through winter resorts like a decorative inevitability. The police later emphasized another contradiction that helped them over time make sense of her. She lived in great luxury while having no known fortune. That alone does not prove theft, but it is the kind of inconsistency that becomes impossible to ignore when paired with recurring hotel complaints and constant movement. It was an early form of what investigators now call lifestyle analysis. Follow the spending, look for the source. What remains hardest to pin down at this stage is the money trail. She was not arrested at a bank. She was arrested in a corridor. But later reporting about the arrest describes cash and jewels found in her room, and a list of hotels with room plans, evidence that suggests both profit and preparation. It implies a system. Steal, convert or hide the goods, spend enough to maintain the disguise, keep enough to continue moving. It also suggests planning not only for theft, but for choice of target, choice of hotel, choice of season. The Comtesse de Montiel was not built on a single lie. She was built on a chain of small, reinforcing truths. A woman who looked expensive. A woman who spoke as if she belonged. A woman who behaved like someone accustomed to being obeyed. A woman who tipped, smiled, and moved through hotel society as if it were her natural habitat. The lie sat inside those truths like a blade. By the time her name was whispered along the coast, she had become a familiar figure. Not a stranger slipping in from outside, but part of the scenery. That familiarity was her camouflage. It also became her weakness. Because the more familiar she became, the more likely it was that someone, a hotel employee, a police inspector, a victim with a sharper memory, would notice that the thefts followed her like weather. And once the police began to believe they were not dealing with coincidence but with a single traveling offender, the case changed shape. It became a hunt. It required officers who could follow her across borders. It required surveillance. It required patience. It required, eventually, waiting quietly for a woman in black to step into a corridor and make her trade visible. But before we reach that night, it is worth pausing on what she achieved for years without violence and without a weapon. She entered the richest rooms in Europe as an honored guest, and took what she wanted not by forcing her way in but by being welcomed. That is the particular darkness of this case. It is not a story about a monster hidden from society. It is a story about how easily society can be persuaded to hand the keys to a stranger, provided the stranger has the right name. Chapter 4. Nice on the Promenade d'Anglais sold a certain kind of safety. The light was softer there, the streets broader, the sea always present like a promise. Visitors came to be restored by winter sun, to gamble at nearby Monte Carlo, to drift through hotels where the carpet's muffled footsteps and strangers were made acceptable by good manners and clean linen. And then there were the other visitors, the ones who came because this was where money slept. By March 1908, the woman known along the coast as the Comtesse de Montiel was not merely a rumor. She was a recognized problem. Two different strands of the record show this. An Australian newspaper report stating that the police had traced her activity across multiple cities and years, and a French report, reproduced from the regional paper Louis Desclair, dated March 11, 1908, that identifies the officers who arrested her and describes the capture in exacting detail. In the French report, the arresting officers are named as two inspectors of the Charité Générale, Benoit and Henique from the Brigade Volonté under M. Sebel, a mobile service designed to move as criminals moved. She had left a trail too long for coincidence. The map was widening. The police needed a fixed point. She was, the French report says, very well known to the Charité Générale, considered by them to be the most skillful hotel thief in the world. They had struggled to arrest her because she stayed only briefly in each place and operated only when opportunity was good, too mobile for ordinary policing, too careful to be cornered. Still, the moment she was reported in Nice, the two inspectors set out. They caught her quickly, not through confession, not through luck, but by waiting for the thing she could not resist. A corridor, a door, a sleeping target. The French account specifies the time as the night from Friday to Saturday, and describes the special costume used by hotel thieves. Condamine, it states, left her room dressed for the job. For women, a black wool knit, a short tight black underskirt and felt sandals. A black veil covered her head. It is difficult to read this detail and not picture her moving without sound, her steps dulled by felt, her face obscured by cloth. Yet this is not invention, it is evidence. It tells us she did not merely rely on charm and title. She prepared physically, practically, mechanically. The target that night is preserved only as anonymity. She approached the door of a room occupied by M and Madame X, described as wealthy foreigners traveling along the coast. Their names are not given in the surviving account. They are reduced in the record to what mattered to her. They were rich and they were behind a door. The arrest did not end with the corridor. It moved immediately into the inventory stage, the part of a case that turned sensation into proof. At the station, she was interrogated for a long time during Saturday. According to the French report, she began by denying involvement. Then police presented the results of a search of her room. After that, she stopped answering questions. What police said they found in her room is the clearest evidence we have of planning, scale, and profit. This is where the case shifts from an arrest to a theory. The room plans suggest intent and preparation. She did not simply arrive and improvise. She mapped. She studied. She selected. Other press reporting adds figures that contributed to her legend. A widely reproduced caption describing her capture states that in her bedroom were 4,000 francs in gold and notes and jewels worth 20,000 francs, and that she owned a handsomely furnished flat in Paris, having passed winters at Nice, Cannes, or other towns on the Riviera. These figures are valuable because they show what police and press wanted the public to understand. This was not petty theft. It was enough to support a lifestyle. Enough to sustain the disguise. Once she was arrested, the story became international. The press could not resist the contrast. A very pretty woman, elegant, well-dressed, claiming a noble title, caught with tools and jewels like a stage prop. Her beauty was used as headline fuel. Her disguise was treated like theater. But underneath the glamour, the facts that mattered to the investigation were plain. An arrest in the act, tools, room plans, cash, jewels. All of it would be used to connect her to the years of complaints that had preceded her. And that is the point at which her story stops being solely a story of theft and begins to become a story of prosecution. What could be proven, what victims could identify, what property could be claimed back, and what the court would make of a woman who had walked the Riviera as a titled guest and left behind robbed rooms. The corridor at last had done what the police could not do for years. It made the Countess visible. It turned a performance into evidence. It turned a name into a case. Chapter 5. Once she was taken, the Riviera did what it always did. It kept shining. The sea remained the same color. The hotels continued to receive guests. The dining rooms filled at the usual hour. The corridor where she'd been arrested went back to being a corridor. A passageway of thick carpet and polished brass where footsteps softened, where doors clicked shut, where nobody wanted to imagine what could happen after midnight. But for the police, the arrest in Nice was not an ending. It was a beginning. For years, the Comtesse de Monteil had been a pattern. A sequence of theft complaints and departures that rarely aligned into something a court could hold. Now there was a fixed point. A woman detained in the act in a hotel on the Promenade d'Anglais, dressed in a specialized black outfit, carrying a tool associated with hotel thieves, and followed by a search that produced not just jewelry and cash, but planning material, lists of hotels and room plans. The case was no longer folklore. It was evidence. She was taken to the station and questioned for hours. At first, the record says she denied involvement. It is a familiar reflex and not necessarily a sign of confidence. It is what criminals do when the story has worked for so long they cannot accept that it has failed. But when investigators produced the results of the search of her room, the items that turned suspicion into material fact, she stopped speaking. Silence is also a tactic. Silence is a refusal to add to the record. For the police, there were now two jobs. The first was immediate, to inventory what they had seized and establish the facts of the attempted burglary. The second was longer and far more complicated, to connect this arrest to everything she had been suspected of before. The police suspicion, stated plainly in the reporting, was that she was not operating alone. They believed she was at the head of an organized group, a band structured enough to move from place to place and disappear when necessary. There is a specific point in the record that reveals how the authorities were thinking: the mention of San Remo. The reporting states that investigators believed she had been in contact with at least one of 3 hotel thieves arrested recently in San Remo. San Remo sits across the border on the Italian Riviera, another winter resort, another magnet for foreign wealth, another place where the same class of traveler moves between hotels and assumes that comfort is a form of security. The implication is clear. Her world was not limited to French towns, and the police were not treating her as a solitary offender. They were treating her as a node in a network. That suspicion mattered because it shaped what came next. If she was the head of an organized band, then the things found in her room were not only the remains of past thefts, they were the tools of future ones. The lists and plans suggested she was planning beyond the hotel she was caught in. The jewels and cash suggested profits that had already been converted into portable wealth. The existence of a specialized instrument and a specialized outfit suggested she had moved from social manipulation into skilled night work, or that she had always done both. The press took these facts and did what the press is built to do. It painted her with language that turned criminality into theater. A hotel mouse, a queen of thieves, a spider. In one country she was framed as the most skillful hotel thief in the world. In another she was reduced to a moral lesson about women who dared to step outside their station. They could not decide whether to be repulsed or impressed, and the uncertainty itself fed the story. There was a reason the reporting lingered on her appearance. It lingered on the fact that she was described as well over 40 and yet looked far younger. It lingered on her elegance. It lingered on the calm she maintained. The public wanted a contradiction. The public wanted to believe that crime had a certain face and she did not wear it. But the court did not care about glamour. It cared about sequence, testimony, and proof. Her case reached the assizes of the Alpes-Maritimes. The language used in the reporting is significant. It describes her being tried during a session of the assizes for numerous thefts committed in hotels in France and abroad. That line tells us two things at once. First, that the prosecution was not limited to a single attempted burglary in Nice. Second, that the court accepted the case as large enough to be framed as a pattern of repeated offending, reaching beyond one town and potentially beyond one jurisdiction. The record does not, in the material presently available, provide a full list of the thefts prosecuted, or the names of all complainants who came forward. That kind of detail exists somewhere, likely in French courtroom reporting, in local papers, in the documents of the assizes, but it is not yet surfaced in the accessible sources we have used so far. What can be stated now is that the authorities presented her not as an amateur caught once, but as a serial hotel thief, operating across borders. It is here in the courtroom that the case would have taken its most difficult shape. In hotel thefts, the victim often cannot tell you precisely when the property disappeared. They can tell you what is missing and they can tell you where it was last seen. But a hotel is a place of constant access. Staff come in to clean, luggage is moved, guests drift in and out. Doors are shut and opened, keys are handled. The value of an arrest in the act is that it bypasses the ambiguity. It gives the prosecution a moment that cannot easily be explained away, an attempt to open a door at night with a specialized tool. From that moment, the prosecution can build outward. They can argue that the items seized, the jewels, the money, were not random. They can attempt to match them to earlier complaints. They can ask victims to identify missing pieces. They can use the lists and plans to show intent and method. The accused did not stumble into crime, she prepared for it. If the court accepted these arguments, the Countess persona would no longer matter. The name would become irrelevant. What would matter would be the plain material of theft: jewelry removed from a case, money taken from a drawer, locks defeated in the night, a plan sketched and carried, hotel names written down in advance. Still, the story could not entirely shed its glamour, because the glamour was part of the mechanism of the crime. Her alleged method, as described in earlier reporting, depended on being welcomed. In some instances, she was said to have been close to the families she robbed, even offering her assistance after the theft. That detail, if presented in court, would have been both damning and difficult. Damning because it suggests manipulation, difficult because it relies on social nuance and credibility. The heart of the case was this: she did not steal as an outsider. She stole as an insider. She did not break into palaces. She moved through the temporary palaces of the rich, hotels, and treated them as a kind of open house. The guests were strangers who did not understand the building. The staff were busy. The seasons were short. The marks were complacent. It was a system built on the assumption that the corridor was safe. The assizes, however, were not a corridor. They were a place where names were demanded, where statements were recorded, where claims were pinned to paper. In court, she would have been stripped of the casual protections of hotel life: the reluctance of others to make a scene, the ease of slipping away, the soft blur of transience. In court, she had to stand still. And still she attempted for as long as possible to remain an enigma. Denial first. Silence after. A refusal to give investigators what they wanted most: a narrative of her own. It is easy, in writing about an imposter, to become fascinated by the impostor itself, to treat the Countess as a character and forget that she was a defendant. The assizes were where that shift was forced. The title was no longer a tool. It was an aggravation, a proof of deception. The glamour no longer made her welcome. It made her notorious. The assizes of the Alpes Maritimes were where the Riviera finally demanded an accounting. The record, as presently available, confirms that she was tried there for numerous hotel thefts committed in France and abroad, after being arrested on the shores of the Bay of Angels. It confirms that the police suspected a wider organization and possible links to thefts and thieves beyond France. It confirms that her arrest yielded cash, jewelry, tools, and planning materials. What remains to be recovered, what sits just beyond the edge of the sources at hand, are the most granular details: the full list of complainants, the specific hotels tied to each theft, the itemized property taken from victims, the sentence handed down, and the courtroom exchanges that would show how she defended herself, if she did at all. Those details exist somewhere in the record. And once they are recovered, the Comtesse de Montile will no longer be merely a silhouette in a corridor. She will be a defendant in full light, with names, dates, and losses stacked against her like evidence on a clerk's desk. For now, the case stands at its formal threshold, the moment where a crime of glamour enters the machinery of law, and the machinery begins slowly to grind. The Riviera did not stop glittering, but it began at last to remember. Chapter 6. The Comtesse de Montile did not build her reputation in one city. She built it along a route, a seasonal circuit that belonged to the rich and to those who lived off the rich. This is one of the most valuable facts in her story because it tells us, in the bluntest way possible, what she was: not a desperate thief, but a mobile professional. She understood where the money traveled, and she traveled with it. Police later reported tracing traces of her exploits across a sequence of places and years. The list is precise enough to be read as an itinerary. Brussels, 1898. London, 1899. Nice, 1900. America, 1901. Then back to the French coast. Arcachon, Menton, Cannes, 1902 and 1903. And beyond these, many other places. It is the list that matters, and the gaps between the entries matter as well. A thief who stays local risks recognition. A thief who travels remains a rumor. The rumors do not connect until police make them connect. The first entry, Brussels, is instructive. Brussels in the late 19th century was a city of money and display, a place that drew diplomats, business figures, and travelers with jewelry that could be worn and moved. A traveler passing through could position herself as aristocracy without being challenged, because strangers are always easier to impress than neighbors. It is here in 1898 that police later said they found traces of her. We do not yet have the victim names or the hotel addresses for Brussels, but the appearance of the city in the police trace tells us the crime was already transnational in ambition. London in 1899 follows neatly. London was a city where wealth was old and where hotels held an entire ecosystem of foreign visitors, servants, staff, and a constant churn of people. It was also a city where class performance mattered, and where a credible countess could move through certain circles with ease. The police trace places her there the year after Brussels, suggesting not a random detour, but movement along the major travel arteries of the era. Then Nice, 1900, the first appearance of the Riviera itself. Nice was already a winter refuge for wealthy travelers, foreign visitors, titled families, gambling tourists, and those who traveled with portable wealth. It is also a city where the hotel becomes both home and stage. A woman who could perform status convincingly could be accepted quickly because everyone wanted her presence to mean something. From Nice, the trace crosses the ocean. America, 1901. This entry is perhaps the most tantalizing precisely because it is so broad. America is a continent-scale note rather than a city. It tells us that police believed she operated there, but the surviving summary does not tell us whether this meant New York, a resort town, or a smaller circuit of hotels. Still, the implication is unmistakable. She was not confined to Europe. She was willing to travel far, and she believed the disguise would travel with her. If you are writing true crime, you learn to respect this kind of entry. It means the police were hearing the same story in more than one place. It means that the rumors had crossed borders, and that someone had decided the story belonged to the same woman. By 1902 and 1903, the trace returns to the French coast and begins to tighten around named resort towns. Arcachon. These names matter because they are not random. They are places defined by seasonal wealth. Arcachon had long been a health resort, a place where affluent visitors stayed for air, rest, and recovery, and where people brought valuables because they intended to stay in comfort for weeks rather than days. Menton and Cannes were part of the Riviera constellation, towns where winter visitors gathered and where hotel life created the perfect conditions for theft, transience, privacy, staff movement, and the social reluctance to make accusations. If you stand back from the list and look at it as a whole, you see the outline of a strategy. The Comtesse de Montiel moved in the same way wealthy people moved. She positioned herself in the same rooms, the same corridors, the same seasonal patterns. She went where valuables were concentrated in private spaces that felt safe. She did not need violence. He did not need a weapon. Her weapon was that she belonged. This is why the title mattered so much. The sources state she was received among genuine nobility in resort towns and was not pressed to prove her identity. That detail is not incidental. It is the key to the circuit. A woman who arrives alone, unintroduced, is a stranger. A countess is a guest. Once she becomes a guest, she gains the invisible privileges that come with wealth and manners. She can drift through corridors without being stopped. She can speak to staff with the authority of someone accustomed to obedience. She can attach herself to families as a friend, so close that later reporting said she sometimes offered to help after a theft, even to assist in tracking the robber. It is a maneuver so audacious it sounds fictional, but it fits perfectly with the social mechanics of an expensive hotel. People are reluctant to suspect those they've welcomed into their circle. The circuit also explains why the case was so difficult to hold. Hotel theft is often discovered too late. A ring is missing, a case is disturbed, a purse is lighter. People blame staff or strangers. They blame their own memory. They hesitate before involving the police. By the time the complaint is made, the suspect has moved on to another city, another hotel, another season. This is the advantage of the circuit. The thief travels faster than the file. And yet the list itself shows that, eventually, the file caught up. The police trace exists because investigators did something slow and old-fashioned. They compared stories. They matched the rhythm of theft complaints with the appearance of a particular elegant woman. They built a case not from one spectacular incident but from repetition. They treated the circuit as evidence. This is how the Comtesse de Montiel begins to appear not as a glamorous anomaly but as a professional. A woman with an itinerary and a method. A woman whose crimes were as mobile as she was. And this is how the story begins to turn toward its inevitable end. Because once the circuit is mapped, the next step is obvious. Wait for her to come home to it. You do not need to predict where she will go next. You only need to watch the hotels. Chapter 7. Every long-running theft career has a practical problem at its center. How do you steal repeatedly and keep living as if you are legitimate? How do you carry the profits without drawing attention? How do you convert stolen objects into money without losing the ability to pass as what you claim to be? For Amelie Condamine, the evidence suggests the answer was both simple and disciplined. She kept her thefts portable, her spending visible, and her planning close. When police finally arrested her in Nice in 1908, the items they said they seized were not merely souvenirs of crime. They were a portrait of how she operated. There was cash. 4,000 francs. There were jewels, described as numerous and very fine. There was equipment associated with hotel thieves. There was a list of hotels with room plans. And there was the detail that gives the arrest its particular chill. She was caught wearing a specialized black outfit and carrying a tool described as a hotel thief's instrument, the wastiti, while attempting entry into a room occupied by a wealthy foreign couple identified only as M and Madame X. Taken together, these facts tell us several things at once. First, she did not rely solely on social access. She could behave as a guest by day, but she was prepared to move as a thief by night. The black veil, the felt sandals, the black knit outfit. These are not theatrical choices. They are practical choices. Concealment, silence, freedom of movement. She dressed to become a shadow. Third, she kept cash. 4,000 francs, seized at the time of her arrest, is not a trivial sum. It suggests liquidity, an ability to pay in hotels, to tip, to travel, to maintain a believable level of comfort. Cash also avoids the paper trail of bank withdrawals and accounts. If you are living under a false title, cash is safer than a signature. It is here that the press begins to attach numbers. One report described jewels in her possession as being worth around 20,000 francs, and framed her as a woman who maintained the outward life of a wealthy traveler, even claiming she had a well-furnished flat in Paris. Whether those figures were exact or inflated, the direction of the claim is consistent with what police said they found. She had enough valuable property to support both a disguise and a life. But the most telling item in the seized list is not cash or jewelry. It is paper. A list of hotels with room plans. Room plans are not necessary if you are stealing impulsively. Room plans are necessary if you intend to operate repeatedly, in buildings you do not control, in spaces that are designed to be private. A plan is a form of rehearsal. It allows you to know where doors are, where service passages run, how rooms are arranged, where corridors end. It allows you to imagine a building before you move through it. This is where police suspicion of an organized band becomes relevant. The reporting states police believed she was the head of a perfectly organized group, and that she had contact with at least one of 3 hotel thieves arrested recently in San Remo. This implies a wider economy than a lone thief with a lucky streak. It implies fencing networks, shared knowledge, shared targets. It implies that hotel theft, like any industry, can be collaborative, and that information can be traded as easily as jewelry. Even if her network cannot yet be named in detail, the evidence seized supports the logic of organization. A list, a plan, specialized tools. These are the signs of method, not whim. And method explains how she could maintain the facade for years. She invested in the lie. If she moved freely, she could steal. If she stole, she could spend enough to keep being believed. This is the loop at the heart of her career, a crime economy that funds its own disguise. And once she becomes a technician, the story changes. Tools can be linked to method. Plans can be linked to targets. Jewels can be identified by victims. Cash can be counted. The evidence economy becomes, for the prosecution, a pathway, from the moment of arrest outward to the years of complaints. This is why the Nice seizure matters far beyond the corridor. It is the first time the authorities could hold not just a suspect but a system, a portable archive of how she lived and how she planned. The Riviera glittered around her. The hotels continued to shine. But the illusion that had protected her for years, that a title could substitute for proof, began to collapse under the weight of objects laid out on a table. 4,000 francs. Room plan. A list of hotels. Fine jewels. A tool. A veil. A woman who had moved through the world as if she could never be questioned, now reduced to what every theft case eventually becomes: a list of items and a sequence of events. She will be a ledger of losses. Chapter 8. If you want to understand why the victim list is so difficult to reconstruct from the surviving reports, you have to understand the hotel itself. A grand hotel is not a home, but it imitates one. It gives you private space while surrounding you with strangers. It gives you a lock, then gives that lock to dozens of other hands: porters, chambermaids, managers, maintenance staff. It gives you a corridor that feels private because it is carpeted and quiet, even though anyone can walk down it. This is also why she could cultivate victims socially and still survive suspicion. The reporting states she made many friends of both sexes, and in some cases became intimate with the families she later robbed, so close that she could offer her help after a theft, even to assist in tracking the robber. That detail is chilling because it implies that her victims were not always strangers. They were sometimes acquaintances, sometimes friends, sometimes the sort of people who would invite her into private rooms, share meals, and speak freely. If you are robbed by a stranger, you are angry. If you are robbed by someone you have welcomed into your world, you are also ashamed. They were ideal victims for a thief who could pass as one of them. From the evidence seized in Nice, we can also infer the types of items likely stolen because the seized items are themselves a kind of sample. Police reported finding numerous fine jewels in Condemine's room, along with a substantial sum of cash, 4,000 francs, plus tools and planning materials. This is not a list of stolen candlesticks or bulky property. It is a list of portable wealth, jewelry and money. Exactly the sort of property that disappears cleanly from hotel rooms. The press, hungry for figures, attached values. One report claimed jewels worth 20,000 francs and described cash in gold and notes. Even if the valuation is treated as press reported until confirmed by a formal court inventory, the focus itself is revealing. The story is not about a thief stealing necessities. It is about a thief stealing luxury, the very objects that signal status. And then there is the most difficult part for any victim-based reconstruction: movement. Police reported tracing her activity across Brussels, London, Nice, America, Arcachon, Menton, and Cannes across the years 1898 to 1903, among other places. That means the victim pool is geographically scattered. It crosses borders. It crosses languages. It crosses legal systems. Even if victims reported at the time, their names may be buried in local papers, court lists, or hotel records, rather than preserved in the widely reprinted summaries that have survived most easily. We have categories: hotel guests, wealthy travelers, rich foreigners. We have a clear immediate target: M. and Madame X. In Nice, 1908. We have a clear pattern: theft complaints following her hotel stays. We have the likely property: fine jewelry, cash. We do not yet have, in the sources currently available, the long list that would make the case feel complete. Full victim names, exact hotel addresses, exact dates of each theft, and item-by-item stolen property tied to specific complainants. Those details almost certainly existed at the time, and likely appeared in French court reporting and local papers. But in what we can presently verify, the victims remain, like the hotel corridors themselves, half-seen. Still, there is one more truth that can be stated without hesitation. The victims of this kind of crime are not only those who lost property. They are also those who lost certainty. A hotel room is meant to be private. Her entire career was built on showing that it wasn't. And when a person realizes they were robbed while they slept in a grand hotel, they do not only lose jewelry. They lose the belief that expensive places are safe places. That is the real theft. The jewels are only the proof. Chapter 9. The arrest in Nice gave police what they had been missing for years: a moment that could not be reframed as coincidence. The years before the arrest were built from complaints, rumors that followed her hotel stays, reports that the thefts appeared wherever she went, traces in different cities and different seasons. Police said they could follow those traces through Brussels in 1898, London in 1899, Nice in 1900, America in 1901, Arcachon, Menton, and Cannes in 1902 and 1903, and many other places. But a trace is not always enough for a courtroom. A trace can be dismissed. A trace can be challenged. A trace can be explained away as gossip, as mistaken identity, as the paranoia of wealthy guests who prefer to blame a stranger rather than admit carelessness. A courtroom wants a fixed point, a witness, a physical object, a scene. Nice provided the scene. The reporting describes a woman leaving her room at night in a black outfit with a veil, wearing felt sandals, carrying a tool described as a hotel thief's instrument, and attempting to open a door occupied by a wealthy foreign couple. The act itself becomes evidence. It gives police an offense that exists in front of their eyes, rather than in the fog of speculation. That kind of arrest changes everything. It gives investigators the authority to search. It gives them objects to seize. It gives them something to present. And what they reportedly seized mattered more than almost any confession could have. 4,000 francs. Numerous fine jewels. Equipment associated with hotel theft. A list of hotels with room plans. If you imagine a prosecutor preparing a case, you can see how those items would be arranged into a story. The cash suggests profits and the capacity to fund travel and luxury. The jewels suggest repeated thefts and valuable property that could be identified by victims. The tools suggest method, skill, and intent. The hotel list and room plans suggest planning, not an impulsive act, but a system. And system is what the prosecution needed to demonstrate. Because the alleged crime was not merely one attempted theft. It was, according to the reporting, numerous thefts in hotels in France and abroad. The case reached the assizes of the Alpes-Maritimes, a court not invoked for trifles. The reporting places her there as a defendant, tried for a pattern of hotel thefts, after being arrested on the shores of the Bay of Angels. If you want to understand how an arrest becomes a broader prosecution, you have to understand the way hotel theft cases are usually built. They are built through identification and comparison. A victim reports a missing ring. Another victim reports missing earrings. Another reports missing cash. Alone, each complaint is a private misfortune. Together they become a pattern. But to connect them, police need something to hold on to, a unique method, a recurring suspect, an object that ties one scene to another. This is where the jewels matter. In a theft case, it's not enough for police to say, "We found jewels." They must say, "We found your jewels." That requires identification. Victims must be asked to describe their missing items in detail. The stone cut, the setting, inscriptions, distinctive flaws, how and when they were acquired. Police must then match those descriptions to what was seized. If a match is made, it strengthens the case not only for one theft but for the credibility of other allegations. The room plans matter for another reason. They demonstrate intent. They suggest she did not merely wander into temptation. She prepared. She selected targets. She chose hotels deliberately. She carried information about rooms. This is precisely the sort of material that a court finds persuasive because it reveals mind and method. It also begins to answer the question that journalists and readers always ask. How did she keep getting away with it? She got away with it because she made it difficult to catch her in the act. The arrest changes that. It provides a moment where she is not a guest, not a countess, not a friend, but a person with a tool at a door in the night. From there, the prosecution can build outward. They can argue that this act reflects a longer career. They can present the police trace of her movements as context, a map of opportunity and flight. They can describe the repeated hotel complaints. They can bring forward witnesses and victims where possible. They can also introduce the police suspicion, reported in the press, that she was linked to a wider organization and had contact with hotel thieves arrested in San Remo. And then there is the defendant's behavior after arrest, another point preserved in the reporting. One narrative is hers, a countess, an elegant woman, a guest who belongs. The title that once protected her becomes, in a courtroom, a kind of aggravation, evidence of deception. The same confidence that made people hesitate to question her becomes, in a courtroom, a kind of arrogance. The glamour that made the press linger becomes irrelevant to the logic of proof. The assizes are not. They are a place where the corridor's silence is forced into speech. Witnesses, documents, statements, inventories, valuations. It is a place where the glittering life of the Riviera is translated into lists, dates, places, objects, names. For years her world was fluid: hotel keys, seasonal travel, friends and strangers, rooms that belonged to no one for long. The law demands the opposite. It demands fixed points. It demands a calendar. By bringing her to the assizes of the Alpes Maritimes, the state attempted to do what the Riviera's hotel culture could not: make her stand still long enough to be counted. Until those documents are brought into view, the shape of prosecution can still be described truthfully, because the mechanics of the case are already there in the evidence seized and the language of the assizes. And meaning, in a case like this, is always measured in names, dates, and objects. The prosecution's job was to sharpen them. Chapter 10. By the time Amelie Condemine was arrested in Nice, the police were no longer speaking about a lone thief with a lucky run. They were speaking, at least in the reporting that survives, about a structure. In the French account of her arrest, the suspicion is stated directly. Police believed she was the head of a perfectly organized band, and that she had been in contact with at least one of 3 hotel thieves arrested recently in San Remo. San Remo is not a trivial detail. It is not a throwaway place name. It is a signal that the police were thinking across borders and across cases, and that they were treating hotel theft as something that could function like a trade, with shared methods, shared intelligence, and shared disposal routes. The same suspicion appears in international reporting. The Tasmanian Daily Telegraph article that summarized her case described her as the leader of a gang of spiders. The term is vivid, and it does a particular kind of work. It frames theft as a web, a trap, and it frames the thief as someone who waits, patient, until the right victim touches the strands. What we do not have, at least not yet in the accessible record, are the names of other members of this alleged group, the exact structure of the band, or documented proof that would allow a courtroom-grade reconstruction of hierarchy. But the fact that police believed there was a band, and the fact that San Remo is cited as a point of connection, gives you something powerful. It shows how the authorities themselves interpreted the pattern once the arrest provided physical evidence. Because the Nice seizure did not look like the belongings of a casual offender. 4,000 francs. Numerous fine jewels. Tools associated with hotel theft. A list of hotels with room plans. These are not the remnants of one small incident. They suggest repetition and planning. The room plans, in particular, are the kind of evidence that makes investigators think in terms of systems rather than impulses. A plan implies forward motion. A list implies future work. If she was connected to other hotel thieves, then the materials seized in her room could have been more than personal. They could have been shared intelligence. Hotels worth targeting, layouts worth learning, routes worth repeating. This is where San Remo becomes especially interesting. San Remo sits on the Italian Riviera, another winter refuge, another wealthy circuit town where travelers carried jewelry and cash, where hotels became temporary homes, where the corridor after midnight was quiet enough for anyone who knew how to move. If thieves had been arrested there and police believed Condamine had been in contact with at least one of them, it suggests an intersection between French and Italian policing concerns, and it suggests that her world extended beyond the borders that most ordinary criminals never cross. It also suggests that her role, whatever its true nature, was not simply that of a burglar. She was an organizer, a coordinator, a person who could manage information, money, and movement. That is what the police believed. And it makes sense because the very nature of hotel theft favors networks. A thief can steal a jewel, but then the jewel must go somewhere. It must be sold, exchanged, pawned, or broken down. It must be converted into usable money. It must re-enter the world without returning the thief to the scene of the crime. This is the part of a theft case that can rarely be seen clearly from a distance, but it is always there underneath. The disposal economy. The press, eager to frame her as a legend, claimed she owned a well-furnished flat in Paris and spoke of the value of the jewels and cash found with her. If even part of that is true, it suggests she had the means to maintain a base, a stable place from which to plan and to store, a location where stolen objects could be hidden and handled, where the Countess persona could be maintained when she was not on the move. A base also suggests connections. A base suggests suppliers, merchants, people willing to deal in questionable goods. It suggests, at the very least, familiarity with the shadow economy that runs alongside respectable society. But none of this can be stated as hard fact beyond what the reporting gives us. So we stay disciplined. What the record confirms is not the full network but the existence of suspicion, and the reasons the suspicion made sense. The seized planning material, the scale implied by the jewels and cash, and the cross-border reference to San Remo. From a narrative standpoint, this is where your true crime manuscript can shift from the individual to the ecosystem. Because even if Condamine acted alone at the door in Nice, her career could not have endured for years without a broader social system that made it possible. A hotel is an ecosystem. It is a moving village of staff, guests, suppliers, and seasonal travelers. It is a place where people do not know each other well enough to recognize strangers, and where strangers are expected to be present. It is also a place where the very things a thief wants, privacy, transience, wealth, are built into the architecture. If you add to this the atmosphere of the Riviera, you get a perfect storm, a dense concentration of affluent visitors in a narrow strip of towns, moving between hotels and casinos, surrounded by strangers and protected by etiquette. That is how a thief becomes a specialist. That is how a specialist begins to look to police like part of something larger. And that is why the spiders matter, even if they remain partly unnamed. They represent the fear that sits behind the glamour of this case. The fear that the Comtesse de Montiel was not simply an imposter but a symptom. A sign that the Riviera's luxury world had become predictable enough and complacent enough that theft could be organized like a business. By arresting her in Nice, the police did more than catch a woman at a door. They seized the tools and papers that hinted at the web. And once a web is suspected, the crime is no longer just personal. It becomes structural. It becomes a question of how many others were moving through the same corridors, in the same silence, under different names. It becomes a question of how the world of wealth, in all its glitter, could be so easily mapped. And it becomes a question of whether Condamine was an exception, or simply the one who was finally caught. Chapter 11. Some criminals disappear into the archive as quickly as they disappear from a street. He didn't. The Comtesse de Montiel remained because she was not merely a thief. She was a contradiction the public couldn't stop turning over in its hands. The press fed that contradiction with care. On one side, a woman described as elegant, very pretty, dressed well enough to be accepted among genuine nobility, moving through the Riviera as if she belonged there. On the other, a woman who, according to police reporting, came from modest circumstances, had no known fortune, and was repeatedly linked to theft complaints wherever she stayed. The story has all the ingredients a newspaper loves: disguise, luxury, a supposedly noble name, and a crime committed not in a dark alley but in the heart of respectable society. This is how a case becomes a legend. Not by inventing facts out of thin air, but by choosing which facts to emphasize, and by choosing a language that makes those facts feel like theater. The language used to describe her is itself part of the story. In the reporting, she was labeled with nicknames that turned her into a creature. A hotel mouse, a queen of thieves, a spider. These aren't neutral terms. They are narrative tools. A mouse makes her sound small and stealthy, almost domestic. A queen makes her sound triumphant. A spider makes her sound predatory and patient, setting traps for the unsuspecting. Each label tells you more about what the public wanted to feel than about what she actually did. And then there are the details that read like stage props but are also, crucially, evidence. The black veil. The felt sandals. The tight black skirt. The tool associated with hotel thieves. The door she was trying to open. A wealthy foreign couple inside, preserved in the record only as M and Madame X. The moment when police intervened. The cash. The jewels. The hotel list with room plans. These details did not need embellishment. They were already cinematic and the press understood it. But the press also did something else. It attached figures. It spoke of thousands of francs, of jewels worth tens of thousands, of a well-furnished flat in Paris. It described the winters she spent in Nice, Cannes, and other Riviera towns. It portrayed the Countess persona as something she wore as naturally as fur. That idea may be partly true. It may also be partly a fantasy that the public found irresistible. The fantasy that a woman could step out of her station, steal from the rich, and finance a life of luxury. It is a fantasy that flatters everyone at once. It flatters the rich by turning them into important targets. But true crime demands a colder view. It asks, what can be proved? Police reported tracing her through multiple places and years: Brussels, London, Nice, America, Arcachon, Menton, Cannes, and others. Police suspected she was linked to an organized band and to thieves arrested in San Remo. She was arrested in Nice in an attempted night entry. In her room were found tools, cash, jewels, and planning materials. She was tried at the Assizes of the Alpes-Maritimes for numerous hotel thefts committed in France and abroad. These are the bones. The press draped them in velvet. A woman who steals from hotel guests disrupts expectations. She does not fit easily into the era's preferred narratives. The press therefore had to decide what she was: a seductress, a trickster, a monster, a curiosity. It chose often to make her glamorous, because glamour was more digestible than the blunt reality of a thief who could walk into high society and take what she wanted. The myth of the Comtesse de Montiel is therefore not only about crime. It is about class anxiety. It is about the fear that status can be forged. It is about the fear that the world of wealth is less secure than it claims. It is about the fear that the corridor is not safe. What survives, a century later, is the residue of that drama. The details we can verify remain sharp: the list of cities, the arrest outfit, the tool, the seized items, the named inspectors, the trial venue. The details we cannot yet verify remain blurry: the full victim list, the full catalog of stolen items, the sentence, the other names in the alleged band, the complete court record. The myth grows in the blur. It always does. The purpose of this manuscript is not to destroy the myth, because the myth tells us something real about the world that produced it, but to keep the myth tethered to what can be proved. To insist that glamour does not excuse vagueness. To insist that a life of disguise still leaves a documentary trail. The Riviera was built for illusion. It welcomes reinvention. It rewards polish. It encourages people to believe in titles and surfaces and elegant names. Condamine understood that. She exploited it. And for years it worked. What remains is a file full of bright places and dark assumptions. A record of a woman who walked through the richest corridors in Europe, and proved that the softest carpets in the world could still hide footsteps in the night. Chapter 12. After the corridor in Nice, the story had to change its setting. The Riviera had been her terrain because the Riviera was built for transients. People arrived under assumed ease, stayed briefly, then vanished into the next season. A grand hotel could swallow a scandal the way it swallowed noise, softly behind thick walls. But once the Comtesse de Montiel was arrested, the case stopped belonging to hotel management and gossip. It belonged to the courts. The most concrete sentencing information we have comes from a report reproduced from Le Petit Journal dated January 21, 1909, which summarizes what happened after trial. It states that during the most recent session of the Assizes of the Alpes-Maritimes, the woman Amelie Condamine, known as the Suisse de Hotel, was judged for numerous thefts committed in hotels in France and abroad, after being arrested on the shores of the Bay de Anges. The sentence reported is blunt and severe. She was condemned to 10 years of travaux forces, 10 years of hard labor. This matters for two reasons. First, it confirms that the authorities treated her as more than a petty thief caught once. 10 years of forced labor is not the kind of punishment handed down for a single minor offense. It implies that the court accepted the prosecution's framing of scale and seriousness: a pattern of theft, a sustained career, a weight of accusations large enough to justify a heavy penalty. Second, the punishment throws cold water on the glamour the press wrapped around her. Newspapers could call her a queen, a spider, a hotel mouse, but the court treated her as what the law recognized: a repeat offender whose crimes cut directly into the security and reputation of elite spaces. The same report states that Condamine appealed to the Cour de Cassation, the highest court in France for matters of law, but that her appeal was rejected. A rejected appeal is another kind of confirmation. It tells us that, at least in the legal framing, the convictions stood. Whatever arguments her defense attempted, they did not persuade the court that the trial process contained a legal error serious enough to overturn the decision. Then comes the final practical detail, the one that closes the courtroom door and opens the prison gate. The report states she would soon be transferred to the Maison Centrale of Montpellier. That one line matters because it gives the story an end point with a place name attached. Not merely imprisoned, but moved into the machinery of the French penal system, into a specific institution in southern France. After years of movement, Brussels, London, the Riviera, America, and back again, the state finally imposed stillness. And yet, even with this clarity, the record remains frustratingly incomplete in the way it often is with cases like this. The sentencing report does not list the individual thefts proven at trial. It does not name the victims. It does not catalog the specific jewelry items linked to specific complainants. It does not tell us exactly how the 10 years were argued or justified in open court. It gives us the headline of justice: tried, condemned, appeal rejected, transfer ordered. In other words, it gives us the shape of legal closure, but not the fine-grained narrative of the courtroom. This is where the contrast between true crime and crime legend becomes stark. The legend wants a dramatic final speech, a courtroom confrontation, a confession, a moment of collapse. The record as we have it offers something more realistic: procedure. A woman who denied, then fell silent. A conviction. A penalty measured in years. An appeal rejected. A transfer to Montpellier. It is not romantic. It is administrative. It is also real. The Comtesse de Montile lived by keeping everything soft and uncertain. Names, rooms, dates, identities, belongings. The law responded by pinning her to a number, 10 years, and a destination: Montpellier. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go. Chapter 13. Some criminals leave behind a long, grim trail after sentencing. Prison letters, escapes, new cases, illness, death notices, a final record that closes the file. With Amelie Condemine, the story does something more unnerving. It goes quiet. What we can verify about her after is, at present, only what the sentencing report implies: that she was to be transferred to the Maison Centrale of Montpellier after her appeal to the Cour de Cassation was rejected. Beyond that, the publicly accessible record we're working with does not currently provide a confirmed later life narrative. No verified release date, no confirmed death date, no confirmed new identity, no documented return to crime. That silence is not unusual for the time, especially for offenders whose fame was built by the press rather than by the state's later paperwork. Once a story stops producing novelty, once the arrest is over, once the trial is complete, newspapers move on. Unless the prisoner escapes, dies dramatically, or reoffends in a way that forces the name back into print, they dissolve into the background. And that, in a way, is the final irony of her life. She built her career on being seen as someone else. In the end, she became almost impossible to see at all. The press had followed her because she was a spectacle. A false countess, elegant and very well known on the coast, caught in a night costume with a tool at a door, with jewels and cash in her room. That version of her was vivid enough to travel internationally, turning up in papers as far away as Australia. But a woman sent into hard labor does not make good copy. Hard labor is not glamorous. It is not a Riviera corridor. It is not a black veil and a plan of rooms. It is discipline, routine, deprivation, and, crucially, it is a life controlled by others. This absence of later detail creates a temptation in true crime writing, to fill the silence with invention. To imagine her in prison, to invent scenes of humiliation or defiance, to speculate about her fate. This manuscript will not do that. What we can do instead is treat the silence as part of the story. The public version of the Comtesse de Montile was created through performance and through the press. Once she was removed from the stage, the world rapidly lost sight of her. If she served her sentence in Montpellier, she would have been one among many. If she was released, she may have chosen another name. If she died in custody or after release, the notice may not have carried the title that made her famous. Even her real name could be misspelled, shortened, or lost in administrative records. The very skill that made her dangerous, her ability to become someone else, is the same skill that may have erased her later life from public view. There is, however, one final thread that remains visible even when she does not. Her case continued to exist in memory because it expressed a fear that did not fade. The fear that wealth and luxury are not protection, only camouflage. The Riviera's grand hotels sold safety as part of their service. She demonstrated that the service was not a guarantee. Her legacy is therefore less about what happened after Montpellier, and more about what her career revealed before it. She revealed that titles could be forged convincingly enough to dissolve suspicion. She revealed that the corridor, the place between private rooms, could be exploited by someone who understood how the building worked and how the people inside it behaved. Those truths do not require a final dramatic scene to hold. Montpellier. 10 years. And then for the public, gone. Because the only way to honor the truth in a story built on deception is to refuse to deceive in return. Conclusion. In the end, the Comtesse de Montiel is not remembered because she was the most violent criminal of her era. Amelie Condemine's story survives in fragments that still have the power to unsettle. The insistence repeated in reporting that she came from modest circumstances near Macon. The way she lived in conspicuous luxury despite no known fortune. The trail of theft complaints that followed her hotel stays. The police trace that places her in Brussels in 1898, London in 1899, Nice in 1900, America in 1901, and then along the French resort circuit. Arcachon, Menton, Cannes in 1902 and 1903, and the arrest that finally fixed her in one place, in one moment, in Nice in March 1908. If you strip away the headlines, you are left with something colder and more modern than legend. A method. The most important fact is not merely that she stole. It is that she stole through belonging. She did not force her way into elite life, she entered it as a guest. She was welcomed among people who should have been best positioned to detect a lie, and yet her title was accepted. She made friends. She became close to families. She was described as offering sympathy and assistance even after thefts had occurred. That maneuver, the thief positioning herself as helper, is not just audacity. It is an understanding of how social trust works, and of how reluctant polite society can be to suspect one of its own. This is why her case is a true crime story in the deepest sense. It is not a story of brute force. It is a story of social engineering. It is a story of how status functions like a key, and how a well-performed identity can override caution. The corridor did not need to be breached with violence. It only needed to be walked confidently. The Belle Époque Riviera was a place of movement. Wealth migrated seasonally, people traveled with jewelry and cash, hotels became temporary homes. Those environments created the perfect conditions for theft. Strangers living close together, staff moving through private spaces, victims reluctant to accuse or cause scandal. The same architecture that provided comfort also provided opportunity. And the same culture that celebrated surfaces also protected the thief who mastered them. She exploited that bargain. If her story has a second, quieter theme, it is the emergence of modern policing. Her mobility frustrated local enforcement because her crimes did not belong to one jurisdiction. She moved faster than the paperwork could follow. The reporting that names a mobile brigade of the Charité Générale, and the inspectors who arrested her, suggests the state was adapting to exactly this kind of offender. One who followed the circuit and made a living in the gaps between cities. In that sense, the Comtesse de Montiel is not merely a criminal figure. She is part of a transition, the point at which police began to conceptualize crime as something that could be organized, mobile, and cross-border, and therefore required organized, mobile response. When her case reached the assizes of the Alpes-Maritimes, and when she was reportedly sentenced to 10 years of hard labor with her appeal rejected and transfer ordered to Montpellier, the story shifted from glamour to machinery. The state did not treat her as a curiosity. It treated her as a repeat offender whose crimes had crossed borders and damaged the confidence of elite spaces. A true crime manuscript is always tempted by the same thing she traded in: invention. There is an easy version of this story that fills in childhood details, invents motives, and turns a woman into a convenient villain or a glamorous anti-hero. The harder version, the only version worthy of the truth, accepts the limits of the record and draws its conclusions from what can be shown. From what can be shown, one fact stands above the rest. The Comtesse de Montiel did not rely on darkness. She relied on politeness. She relied on the fact that people do not want to be rude to someone who looks important. She relied on the belief that a countess must be real because nobody would dare pretend. She relied on the way wealth, in its comfort, becomes complacent. In the hotel corridor, that complacency was measured in seconds. The pause before suspicion, the hesitation to accuse, the assumption that everything was safe because everything looked expensive. She walked through that pause. She walked through those corridors. And for years the doors opened. In the end, the case offers a bleak lesson, and it is not limited to the belle époque. Luxury is not protection. It is a mask. And sometimes the person wearing it is the thief. Appendices. Appendix A. Verified timeline working chronology. 1898. Brussels, Belgium. Police later reported traces of her exploits in Brussels in 1898. Specific hotels, victim names, and itemized property are not preserved in the accessible reporting currently in hand. 1899. London, United Kingdom. Police later reported traces of her exploits in London in 1899. Specific hotels, victim names, and itemized property not yet identified in the accessible record. 1900. Nice, France. Police later reported traces of her exploits in Nice in 1900. Specific hotels, victim names, and itemized property not yet identified in the accessible record. 1901. America. Location unspecified. Police later reported traces of her exploits in America in 1901. The record available at present does not specify city, state, victims, or items. 1902 to 1903. Arcachon/Menton/Caen, France. Police later reported traces of her exploits in Arcachon, Menton, and Caen across 1902 and 1903. Specific hotels, victim names, and itemized property not yet identified in the accessible record. Undated within the above years. Biarritz/Arcachon, France. Reporting states she was socially well received among circles described as genuine nobility in resort towns such as Biarritz and Arcachon. Reporting also states she made friends of both sexes, became close to families later robbed, and in some cases offered to help after thefts occurred. March 1908. Nice, France. Bay of Angels/Promenade d'Anglais area. The arrest, night from Friday to Saturday, pre-dawn timeframe in later accounts. Arresting officers named in reporting. Inspectors Benoit and Henique, Chirite Générale, attached to a mobile brigade service under M. Sebel. Arrest description as reported. She left her room at night wearing a black knit/wool outfit with a tight black underskirt, felt sandals, and a black veil. She approached a room occupied by M and Madame X, described as wealthy foreign travelers. She produced an ouistiti, a tool described as used by hotel thieves, and began to open the door. Police intervened and arrested her in the act. Search/seizure following arrest as reported. Police reportedly seized 4,000 francs. Numerous fine jewels. Hotel thief equipment. A list of hotels with room plans. Interrogation as reported. She initially denied involvement. After police presented the results of the search, she ceased answering questions. Police suspicion of wider organization as reported. Police believed she was the head of a well-organized band. Police believed she had been in contact with at least one of 3 hotel thieves recently arrested in San Remo, Italy. Assizes of the Alpes Maritimes, trial, date stated as the most recent session in reporting. Later summary published January 1909. She was tried at the Assizes of the Alpes Maritimes for numerous thefts committed in hotels in France and abroad. The currently accessible summary does not list each charge, named victim or item-by-item property. January 21, 1909. Sentence reported. Sentence reported. 10 years of travaux forces, hard labor. Appeal to the Cour de Cassation reported as rejected. Transfer reported to the Maison Centrale of Montpellier. Appendix B. Victim Index, currently limited by the surviving record. Important limitation. The accessible reporting available at present rarely preserves victim names. Most victims appear as categories, hotel guests, wealthy foreigners, rather than identifiable individuals. This index therefore records only what can be verified. M. and Madame X. Nice, March 1908. Description in reporting. Wealthy foreign couple traveling along the coast. Location. Nice hotel, exact hotel name not stated in the contemporaneous arrest report. Role. Targeted room at the moment of arrest. Property stolen. None recorded, attempted entry interrupted. Other guests, multiple, unnamed. Various hotels. Reporting states that in hotels where she stayed, other guests generally complained of being robbed. Individual names, items, and dates are not presently available in the sources in hand. Families/social acquaintances unnamed. Resort towns including Biarritz and Arcachon. Reporting states she formed friendships, became close to families later robbed, and sometimes offered to assist after thefts occurred. Individual names, items, and dates are not presently available in the sources in hand. Appendix C, Evidence Inventory, Arrest/seizure materials. Items associated with the attempted theft. Nice, March 1908. Black veil worn at time of arrest. Felt sandals worn at time of arrest. Black knit/wool outfit with tight black underskirt, worn at time of arrest. Wastiti tool, described as a tool used by hotel thieves. Items reportedly seized from her room. Nice, March 1908. 4,000 francs, cash. Numerous fine jewels. Equipment used by hotel thieves. General description in reporting. A list of hotels with room plans. Interpretive note, kept strictly within what evidence implies. The hotel list and room plans indicate preparation and planning rather than purely opportunistic theft. The presence of portable wealth, cash and jewels, is consistent with hotel theft where valuables are intended to be concealed and transported quickly. Appendix D, Identities/aliases/associated names. Primary identified individual. Amelie Condamine. Known publicly by the alias/title, Comtesse de Montaille. Named police officers and officials as reported. Inspector Benoit, Chourit Général. Inspector Henique, Chourit Général. M. Sebel, associated with the Mobile Brigade Service. Unnamed/anonymized figures in the record. M. and Madame X. Wealthy foreign couple in Nice, targeted at time of arrest. 3 hotel thieves arrested in San Remo, unnamed in accessible reporting. Appendix E, Gaps in the record for transparency. These are the exact categories of detail not currently recoverable from the accessible sources used so far, but which are likely to exist in archival newspapers, court records, or civil documents. Parents' full names, father's confirmed occupation, household address in Macon, requires civil birth record/acte de naissance. Education. School name, level of schooling, apprenticeships, or early employment records. Marriage record details, if applicable spouse name, date/place, witnesses. Named victim list with itemized stolen property per incident, likely in court reporting and indictment lists. Full trial narrative. Prosecution statements, defense arguments, witness testimony, complete sentencing details beyond the headline term. Confirmed later life outcome. Incarceration details, release date, death record, or later reoffending under another identity.